Olá, eu me chamo David Carneiro, sou professor do Instituto de História da Universidade Federal de Uberlândia, também sou professor do programa de pós-graduação em História da mesma universidade e sou atualmente coordenador do Laboratório de História do Trabalho, da Educação e da Violência. Sejam então todos bem-vindos e bem-vindas ao nosso primeiro evento do primeiro ciclo de debates do nosso laboratório, do LAHTEV, onde nós abordaremos nas próximas 5 semanas temáticas relacionadas com a micro-história italiana, que é uma das áreas que eu tenho dedicado às minhas pesquisas. Todas as nossas conversas terão um eixo comum, a trajetória pessoal dos entrevistados, a questão do historiador na época da pandemia, a micro-história, evidentemente, e perguntas de caráter teórico-metodológicas sobre a obra dos convidados, Giovanni Levi, Maurizio Gribaudi, Simona Cerutti, Angelo Torre e Carlo Ginzburg, evidentemente. Então, para a gente inaugurar nosso simpósio virtual, contamos hoje com a presença do professor e historiador Carlo Ginzburg, que muito gentilmente aceitou o convite para conversar com a gente hoje. Carlo é um historiador que dispensa apresentações, é considerado um dos pais da micro-história e uma referência incontornável da historiografia contemporânea. Ele é autor de mais de uma dezena de livros e vários artigos em inúmeras línguas, tem ocupado seu tempo e suas pesquisas com análises minuciosas, mas reveladoras de realidades muito mais amplas, né? Além disso, ao longo de mais de 50 anos de trabalho, ele elaborou também métodos e teorias que renovaram o nosso campo de estudo. Hoje nós conversaremos com ele, sobretudo, a respeito de questões conceituais e teóricas relacionadas a um livro que eu estou escrevendo a respeito da obra dele, mas também sobre o nosso contexto político, sobre essa pandemia mundial que a gente vem enfrentando. Eu combinei com o Carlo, então, de fazer as perguntas em português e ele de respondê-las em inglês. Carlo, la mia conoscenza dell'italiano è primaria, ma siate molto benvenute e grazie mille per aver accettato l'invito così gentilmente a questa conversazione.
It's a great privilege, it's a joy, it's an honor to be here. So thank you very much, Davy, and I would like to say that I'm very happy that the students of the University of Uberlândia are able to follow our conversation. So please go ahead with the first question.
Ok. Carlo, em um texto que recentemente foi publicado aqui no Brasil, intitulado Vínculo e Vergonha, você afirma que, em muitas ocasiões, nosso vínculo com o corpo social é mais pautado na vergonha do que no amor. Analisando o conceito de eidos, vemos que eidos designa o sentimento coletivo de honra e as obrigações decorrentes com um grupo, né? Mas esse sentimento é fortalecido e essas obrigações são sentidas de modo mais aguda quando a honra coletiva é ferida. E nesse momento de pandemia, a honra ferida de todos torna-se, em alguns países como o Brasil, a vergonha de cada um. Podemos aplicar suas reflexões para pensar o tratamento que os governos, principalmente da Itália e do Brasil, têm dado à questão da pandemia? Se não, como devemos pensar essa pandemia?
Well, this is a very challenging question. And certainly, I regard a sort of, an attitude denying the impact or even the existence of the pandemic, not only absurd, but criminal. But on the other hand, I think that the way in which the pandemic has been, let's say, controlled or imperfectly controlled in different countries raises a real problem. And I think the problem, it's important because even if, hopefully, this pandemic will be over, we don't know whether it will re-emerge in a not distant or distant future. So I think that there is a kind of analytic work to be done, comparing the different ways in which I'm going to say maybe the governments reacted to the pandemic. So when you say Italy, I'm immediately compelled to make a distinction. Because in fact, I think that the real disaster about Italy was related not to Italy as such, meaning the central government, but to Lombardy.
Okay.
Because when we make a comparison between Lombardy and Veneto, the Venetian region, which are, let's say, neighboring, we can see the distinction and the difference, the gap, because Lombardy was a real disaster. And from Lombardy, I mean, the virus spread to other regional, regions in Italy. So I think that, let's say, Italy is not necessarily the main actor. Well, it became later an actor, but so we have to try to understand who were the actors in the reaction to the pandemic. So, for instance, why Taiwan reacted so effectively? I mean, this is a case which deserves to be looked at very closely. And so, I mean, there is a lot of work to be done trying to understand analytically how the pandemic has been, let's say, answered or not. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
And the relation with your thinking, vergonha vínculo e vergonha.
Well, I mean, I think that this is something which, for me, it has been a kind of discovery. In other words, to realize that shame is such a bond, in a sense, even stronger than love when we are talking about our country. But then this is the beginning of the story, because, for instance, in this case, I start to make distinctions. And then, obviously, I also ask myself why the government, central government in Italy, did not react quickly to the spread of the pandemic coming from Lombardy. And so, certainly, shame plays a role once again. But again, I think that, let's say, this feeling is just the beginning of the story. And then we have to ask ourselves questions. And so we have to use, if you like, the tools of historical reflection, starting from comparison.
Ok. Além disso, no seu ensaio Tolerância e Comércio, baseado numa concepção do grande Erich Auerbach, você fala de um mundo que caminha para uma homogeneização cultural. Em outro ensaio sobre o Hobbes, você prevê a possibilidade de surgimento de um super-leviatã internacional, nascido da necessidade de regular o uso dos recursos naturais. Nós podemos dizer que a pandemia seria um evento que coloca o mundo ainda mais nessas direções? Como você enxerga o mundo pós-pandemia? Do you agree with the considerations that Agamben did about pandemic?
Not at all. Actually, I mean, I gave a little lecture online in which I strongly rejected Agamben's approach. So I can send it to you. I mean, it has been translated into French and other languages. So in any case, so the idea of, let's say, of denying the impact or even the existence of the pandemic seems to me absurd. And actually, I tried in my lecture to, let's say, unfold the implications of this denial in Agamben's case. But this is another matter. When you when I spoke, following Auerbach, of, let's say, a kind of homogenization of the world, I mean, okay, this is certainly true when we think of the pandemic, because for the first time in history, we have been able to follow the spread of the pandemic nearly in real time. Obviously, the data were very often manipulated by the governments, but this is something, this sort of global gaze at the spread of the pandemic, something which would have been unthinkable until today. So we touch what homogenization means, in this tragic context. On the other hand, when I spoke about let's say, Hobbes and sort of future, which I said hopefully it will not come out. I mean, I was not obviously thinking of the pandemic. The essay was written more than 10 years ago. But then suddenly I saw on the web that a French site, a French actually electronic journal, put my essay online, saying, let's look at this essay in the context of the pandemic. And so actually I realized that it was a sort of, the context in which myself could read my own essay and become different.
Yeah.
There is certainly a sort of sinister side in this tragedy. Sinister meaning that something even worse can take place. In other words, the need for a global control. That was, let's say, my fantasy starting from Hobbes. I was thinking about, as I said, about the pollution of the environment. The pandemic is something different, related, we don't know, but in any case. So, to reflect upon this possibility is not absurd.
Ok. So, entrando agora em questões mais historiográficas e conceituais. Recentemente, o seu livro I Benandante, que no Brasil foi traduzido como Andarilhos do Bem, completou 50 anos. Em um artigo seu sobre esse aniversário, que foi publicado recentemente no Brasil, no livro organizado pela Maíra Vendrame e pelo Alexandre Karsburg, ele traz as memórias sobre a sua trajetória de um jovem historiador à procura do seu objeto. Como você sabe, a gente já tem conversado há algum tempo, eu e o Daniel Berbert estamos escrevendo um livro sobre a influência da literatura, autores russos, sobre o estranhamento que você chama de proustiano, de autores franceses, do 19 e do 20, a influência da história da arte sobre a parte de Ab Warburg e da filosofia, de Walter Benjamin, na sua forma de fazer e de pensar história. Então, hoje a nossa conversa vai seguir mais esse caminho. Então, nesse contexto, eu gostaria de saber de que maneira o seu contato com o Warburg Institute, um pouco antes de você lançar o Andarilhos do Bem, e com a própria obra do Ab Warburg, influenciou a escrita desse livro. Mas não somente desse livro, mas para saber, na verdade, Andarilhos do Bem e História Noturna têm uma relação grande, né, um grande projeto que durou aí mais de 20 anos, né? Então, eu gostaria de saber também a influência desse instituto e desse autor para você pensar a questão da morfologia e a maneira como você acaba resolvendo a questão dos arquétipos, morfologia e arquétipos, elementos tão presentes em História Noturna.
Well, this is a very challenging question, but first of all, I would like to thank you and your friend for this project. I'm obviously delighted and pleased and flattered, but and certainly this is very challenging because I'm compelled to think about my own work in a different perspective, starting from your questions. Okay. I would say, well, certainly, you mentioned something which is related to my background along the years, but then there is the interaction with the evidence. And I think this is unpredictable. In other words, even if I had previous questions, without the encounter with the evidence, those questions would have never unfolded their implications. Now, you asked about Warburg. I was a student at the Scuola Normale in Pisa. And as I recalled a few times, including that essay on I Benandanti 50 anni dopo, 50 years later, which is going to be published in Italian as well in a slightly different version, because the book is going to be republished in Italian next month.
Cool.
I said that when I was a student in Pisa, I suddenly made a triple decision. And I'm very skeptical about my own recollections, because I understand how memory is plastic and it can be manipulated even unknowingly. But in this case, I think that my memory is extremely vivid. And I remember this absurd moment in which I made that triple decision. First, trying to become a historian. Secondly, working on witchcraft trials. And thirdly, trying to rescue the voices and the attitudes of the defendants. Now, I was completely unaware that the third project implied a lot of obstacles, and also there were theoretical and methodological implications which I was completely unaware of at that moment. But I wonder whether, let's say, my drive towards method and methodological reflections would have worked even in a different case and working on a different topic. I have no idea. But in any case, I was aware that behind my choice, there were some books, not yet Aby Warburg, but let's say Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci's notebooks, what he wrote in the fascist prison, and then Ernesto De Martino's book Il Mondo Magico, and Carlo Levi's book Cristo si è fermato a Eboli, Christ stopped at Eboli. I was unaware of the, let's say, autobiographical implications of my choice, especially of the second project. In other words, working on the victims of the persecution. Yeah. And this was, as I realized, much, much later. It was related to my experience as a Jewish child during the war. So, in any case, I started to work on witchcraft trials, and I was still a student at the Scuola Normale, and I had this feeling of intellectual isolation, which is very strange because, I was talking about my project to close friends, most of them students at the Scuola at the moment, but this feeling of isolation was very strong. Let's say, there was nothing sad about that. Actually, there was something euphoric, like walking on a lonely road, something which I experienced years later during the night with a full moon, and this remembered me this feeling of intellectual isolation. But there was an exception. Well, I should also mention my, let's say, interaction with my teachers, and this was very important. But then, in terms of context, I realized that the Warburg Institute and the journal of the Warburg Institute was, let's say, a kind of a point of reference. And so I started to read articles in the journal, including Aby Warburg's famous lecture on the snake, which gave when he was a patient in a clinic, because he had
anthropological work.
Yeah, and so and then so I started to think about this, and during my work on the Benandanti, on my first book on witchcraft trials, I was able to spend 1 month at the Warburg Institute. Now, why? How? My mentor, as they say, was a great historian, Delio Cantimori. Sí. And even as his major work on Italian heretics in the Renaissance has been translated into German by Werner Kegi, the great historian biographer of Jakob Burckhardt. there is no, let's say, either French or English translation. Actually, the English translation was supposed to be performed by Francis Yates, but unfortunately this did not take place. So in any case, Cantimori was, let's say, the living historian at that time who had the larger impact on me. And I learned a lot from him. Especially what I learned was slow reading as an experience. And only later I discovered that using this word slow reading, this was the definition given by Friedrich Nietzsche when he was still a philologist, not yet a philosopher. And he said in his inaugural lecture at Basel, he said that philology is the art of slow reading.
Cool.
And I still remember, I mean, this for me was a sort of, unforgettable. And I still remember when I was a student, at the very beginning of my trajectory as a student in Pisa, I attended a seminar on Burckhardt given by Cantimori. And Cantimori, at the very beginning of the seminar, said, we are going to read the meditations on world history by Burckhardt. Who is able in this class to read German? And a few students were able to read German, certainly not me. And he said, well, we are going to compare different translations. So we started, and the seminar lasted 1 week, and we met every day, I think 3 hours or even 4 hours each morning. After 1 week, we had read 1 page. And this for me was unforgettable. I would have never suspected that this kind of slow reading was possible. And I think that what I tried to do as a scholar and then as a teacher was to share with my students this experience. Actually, it started when I was teaching at UCLA, making a joke about fast food, fast reading. No, slow reading. Slow reading.
And slowly food.
And slow food. Okay. So, yeah. So, I mean, Warburg. Cantimori was connected to the Warburg Institute. I mean, his political career was extremely complicated. His father wrote a biography of Giuseppe Mazzini. He was a kind of follower of Mazzini. Mm-hmm. Young Cantimori became a fascist, as a left-wing fascist, he said. And then he married a woman, Emma Cantimori Mezzomonti, who was an underground communist in the 30s, an underground communist. And so he, let's say, practiced a kind of simulation and dissimulation way of writing, which later on led him, at that moment, led him to make a major discovery as a historian, meaning the importance of religious simulation and dissimulation in 16th century Europe, and first of all, Italy. So there was a kind of connection between his own practice as a kind of underground anti-fascist, but still a fascist overtly, and the discovery of, let's say, simulation and dissimulation, hidden Protestants in 16th century Italy. Actually, I wrote a book on this, which is dedicated to his memory because he died in the meantime. Now, Cantimori, notwithstanding the fact that he was still a fascist in the 30s, was closely related to the Warburg Institute. And in 1960, I was in London as a student, and Cantimori introduced me to the Warburg Institute physically. We entered, and on the door, we met Gertrude Bing, who, worked very closely with Abi Warburg, was at that time the director of the Warburg Institute. And so they met as friends. And Cantimori introduced me, and I remember that Gertrude Bing said to me, "Good training Well, it was my training, in fact, part of my training. And that library, which has been, as you know, transferred from Hamburg when Hitler seized the power to London, and still in London. So, it's has been arranged according to Aby Warburg's project. And he wrote that famous sentence, which is so enlightening: the book you are looking for is close to the book you are. No, the book you need is close to the book you are looking for.
Yeah.
You need. So, I worked in that library, and actually some years ago, 10 years ago, I think I wrote a little piece called Une machine à penser on the Warburg Library. Why? Well, because it's in fact a sort of engine which make you think, in a way following unconsciously some suggestions put by Aby Warburg, arranging his own library. Then obviously there are many more books, but and then I also made an allusion to Le Corbusier, because actually Fritz Zaxler, successor of Aby Warburg, was thinking about, to ask Le Corbusier to build the library in Hamburg. So in any way, une machine à penser. And so I tried to think, and I spent 1 month over there when I was already working on I Benandanti. So first I came across, let's say, the archival evidence, and then I worked on the context and so on and so forth.
Okay.
Now, it's a long answer, but your question was challenging.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I've been thinking about Warburg, and I think that the connection between history and morphology, and the disjunction also between history and morphology, which became so important in my work, is certainly related to Warburg's own work, because he started working as a historian in, let's say, Florentine archives, and making detailed work in Florentine archives. But at the end of his life, he was working on a completely different project, meaning Mnemosyne, and this was based on morphological similarities. So, especially in my book on the Witch's Sabbath, Storia Notturna, I try to use the two methods, and also using morphology as a tool which could contribute to the historian's work.
Okay, very good. Uma questão que eu acho importante é que diversas vezes, ao descrever seu método de trabalho, você diz partir de um tema ou objeto até então pouco conhecido. Você fala, inclusive, de uma certa necessidade dessa sensação inicial de não saber nada, que dá até um certo prazer, né? Nessa estratégia de tentar conhecer a realidade a partir da sua opacidade, eu reconheço no seu trabalho aquele tipo de estranhamento praticado por Proust. E junto dele, eu também vejo a eleição de afinidades formais, por assim dizer. Não só com imagens, aí retomando os conceitos de Warburg, né, de Pathosform, mas em muitos textos, e até mesmo no seu livro Medo, Reverência e Terror, a respeito de ideias, do que você vai chamar de logosformel, né, que permitem muitas vezes fazer associações e mapear o desenvolvimento histórico e morfológico de um objeto ou de uma ideia que você está estudando. Mostrando, assim, sobrevivências, né, aquilo que o Warburg vai chamar de Nachleben des Antiques, e usos e seus usos, né, e as suas mudanças. Eu estou correto? Em resumo, eu gostaria de saber como você pensa metodologicamente sua estratégia de escrita quando você está concebendo um texto. Como é que você articula narrativa, conceitos, teoria, para tornar seu objeto, seu tema mais inteligível para os seus leitores?
Once again, a very challenging question. But I have no strategy. Let's start from the end of your question. I have no strategy when I start to work on a topic. In other words, I think that, let's say, the strategy emerges from the interaction of the evidence. But certainly, what you said about estrangement is something which became crucial in my work, even before, let's say, writing an essay on estrangement as a device, starting from the great literary critic, Russian literary critic, Shklovsky, Viktor Shklovsky.
Mm-hmm.
So even before, I think that, let's say, there was kind of, I took for granted the fact that disciplines are not important.
Okay.
In other words, I never emphasized the need for interdisciplinary work because this seems to me obvious.
Okay.
So the lack of a, let's say, how can I say, sort of a parochial feeling of being an historian, well, has been always foreign to me. I used to say, for me, history, I mean, it's not a house, it's an airport. So you may start from that in all possible directions. So the idea that there is no harmony, pre-established harmony between, let's say, a topic and a discipline seems to me obvious. So we are compelled to learn from, very often, from other disciplines. And I think that the problem is not simply to include data from other disciplines, but we have also to become aware of the way in which those data have been worked out.
Okay.
So we have to be aware of the methods used in other disciplines. So let's say, for instance, I mean, in the case you mentioned the images. I'm not an art historian, although I've been working very often on images. I'm fascinated by images, and especially by painting, but also by methods used by art historians.
Okay.
So, for instance, I mean, connoisseurship. I'm not a connoisseur at all, even if when I walk in a museum, I'm making guesses all the time, very often wrong guesses, but let's say attributing paintings to wrong people. Who knows? Well, sometimes there are known paintings, famous paintings, and sometimes I'm right. It happens. In any case, I'm fascinated by connoisseurship, even if I'm not a connoisseur. So I wrote an essay some years ago on ekphrasis and connoisseurship. So ekphrasis, the Greek word which means description. And so the relationship between a verbal description of a painting and the painting and the act of attributing the painting. And I worked on a very special case in which a verbal description provided by the great Italian art historian Roberto Longhi included a prediction which allowed an English connoisseur to recognize the author of a drawing. Titani, cinerei e nebbiosi. Ash-like, fog-like titans. This is a strange double metaphor, paved the way to the attribution of a drawing, which this English connoisseur, great English connoisseur, Philip Pouncey, well, he looked at the drawing and immediately thought about, let's say, Longhi's description, which was referred to a 16th century painter from Ferrara, Bastianino. So the idea that a description can be not only related to a past experience, but can have a predictive value seemed to me extremely interesting. Now, this is an anomaly. It's an extreme case, but I've been since a long time interested in anomalies and the implications of anomalies. I used to say,
and details.
Huh?
And details.
And details, but also anomalous details. Yeah. So, I mean, the fact of being confronted with something which is completely unknown to us, seems to me, let's say, part of our experience. And I used to say that to find what we are looking for, period, is not enough.
Okay.
We have to look for something more, something else, something different. And so, let's say, the idea is to not only to react to something which is unknown, but also to try to produce the possibility of meeting something unknown.
Okay, cool.
So, let's say, the role of chance in research and producing chance. I mean, I started a long time ago playing with catalogs, card catalogs, but then I started the same game at a different speed with electronic catalog. And so using Google, not only in order to find answers to our questions, to my questions, but also in order to find unexpected questions which would lead to other questions, which would lead to libraries and books, and so on and so forth.
But
So,
when you see an image,
yeah,
you think in terms of Pathosform, and you think in terms of Nachleben, for example, or no?
Well, first of all, okay, this notion of Pathosformel, it's a notion used by Warburg, and I suggested a word which is shaped on Pathosformel, meaning logosformel. In other words, which was not used by Warburg, it's my suggestion.
Yes.
In other words, we have, let's say, formulas which are related to emotion, but can be related to ideas as well. Yeah. And so this was my suggestion. Now, I was able to discover the source of Warburg's idea of Pathosformel, which is surprising because a lot of great scholars have been working on this, but nobody realized that, in fact, the source was hidden in a footnote of a book, which Warburg labeled, at last, a book which is helpful to me. And this was Charles Darwin's Expression of Emotions in Men and Animals. Yeah. And so there's a footnote in which Darwin quoted a passage from Reynolds' lectures on painting, the great 18th century painter Reynolds, Joshua Reynolds. And he said, Reynolds, in this footnote, he said the expression of joy and the expression of terror can be expressed sometimes in the same way. And this is the very root of Warburg's idea. So he started, I never quoted Reynolds as far as I know, maybe some of his handwritten legacy in London, there is a reference to this, but it's, let's say, concealed in that footnote, in that book, which everybody quoted, because Warburg said, I'm learning from this book, from Darwin's book, but we have to read slowly.
Slowly.
Looking at the footnotes as well. But I mean, I was surprised because, great scholars looked at that book, but this was missed. But how many things am I missing? Every time, a lot. So, research is endless. And there are, let's say, as I used to say, blind spots.
Yeah, cool.
Blind spots. Actually, this is a digression. I gave a lecture and I wrote an essay on a blind spot in the work of the writer who apparently is the most unlikely example of having a blind spot in his work, because he controlled everything.
Yeah.
His name is Dante. Now, in Dante's comedy, you have the feeling that he controlled everything. Yeah. But I tried to find a blind spot. And actually, I gave this lecture in the, if you like, the obvious place. In other words, the Sigmund Freud Museum in Vienna. Because this idea of a blind spot is in fact related to our unconscious. We are aware that there is something which is a blind spot in our mind. So this is Freud, or at least, I mean, it existed before, of course, but we became aware of the notion of a blind spot through Sigmund Freud. I think I must say, okay, I dislike Jung.
I think with you.
Deeply. And actually, I mean, when you mentioned archetypes, well, actually, I think the only reference to archetypes in my book, Storia Notturna, is related to, let's say, a dismissal. In other words, I say that I'm not dealing with archetypes. No, I think his work, I mean, maybe I'm deaf, to use a metaphor. I'm deaf to Jung, but no, I'm unable to use Jung's work. And actually, I deeply uneasy with Ernst Gombrich's suggestion that Warburg's project can be compared to Jung's archetypes. I think there is no connection at all. I mean, Gombrich was a great art historian, and I learned that I was lucky enough to meet him and to learn from him and from his writings. But his book on Warburg is paradoxical because, I mean, he wrote that book and there is no sympathy. He had no sympathy, no intellectual sympathy for Warburg. But notwithstanding that, the book, let's say, had a sort of unintended effect and started a new Warburg renaissance. So, I mean, I think that there is a real difference between Jung's archetypes and Warburg's Pathosformel, because, I mean, in the case of Warburg, even if those emotions are deeply related to our attitude as human beings, as animals, we could say, there is a historical transmission of the way of, which is related to the formula. So the pathos can be, let's say, not related to time, because or only to time in a long evolutionary perspective. But the formula is related to history, and that's the difference between Warburg's Pathosformel and Jung's ahistorical archetypes.
Historical, yeah. Em complemento, então, à pergunta anterior, você vê a influência do Ab Warburg na sua forma de conceber a história, de conceber essas múltiplas temporalidades, essa influência do passado, de vários passados no presente, na qual os objetos de pesquisa estão inseridos, de conceber, então, a sobrevivência e as mudanças?
Well, I mean, I think that, let's say, I was fascinated by Warburg's fascination by irrational phenomena, but also by his attitude, which was not rationalistic, in other words, not reductive, but also not simply echoing the irrational. So there is this notion of distance, which seems to me crucial. Actually, I remember Gertrude Bing, in an essay which was published as an introduction to the Italian translation of Warburg's essays, stressed this notion of distance as crucial in the case of Warburg. And actually, many years later, I published a book which is now being republished with an addition, which is called Occhiacci di Legno. It has been translated into Portuguese as well. Yeah. And so now there is a new edition with not only 9 reflections on distance, but 10 reflections on distance. So there is a new essay, let's say. And this notion of distance is crucial. So there are many implications. I would say even political implications. For instance, I would say the rejection of empathy as an analytic notion. Because in my view, empathy is misleading because it implies that we can identify ourselves with the inner feelings of a person which maybe belongs to a completely different culture. Now, I think that we have to oppose to empathy philology. Philology, in a broad sense, in Giambattista Vico's broad sense. In other words, we have to learn the language in the multiple meanings of the word language, the culture of, let's say, which is the culture of this given individual. And so we have to, let's say, fight against our embedded provincialism, which is related to our ego. So we have to learn how to, well, this is philology after all. Yeah. Not only slow reading, but slow reading of sometimes a foreign language. Yeah.
Cool.
So distance. And I think that distance implies this. And so, for instance, I mean, in the case of an image, I can react immediately to an image, but then, let's say, the creation of a distance begins, and this can last for years. Okay. I still remember, I mean, I wrote in, you mentioned this as this book, Fear, Reverence, Terror. And there is a, I think the last essay is on Picasso's Guernica.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I saw Guernica first in reproduction, then I saw Guernica in Madrid, but the very beginning of that essay took place in Marseille, in France. And I was entering the Marseille Museum for the first time, that was many, many years ago, with Jacques Revel, the French historian. And I remember that we entered a room and I looked at a huge painting in front of me and I said, Guernica. Now, the painting was a painting by a completely different painter, not Picasso, mm-hmm. A painter I was completely unaware of, Topino Lebrun, a French late 18th century painter, actually a follower of Gracq-Babeuf, the one of the earliest theoreticians of communism, of agrarian communism. And actually, he was sent to the guillotine. And Topino Lebrun as well. And actually, that painting, which evoked to me Guernica, I mean, I was reacting to the form, not to the subject. It was a sort of a morphological reaction. Okay. It was, in fact, a painting celebrating Caius Gracchus, the Roman tribune, and so it was indirectly a homage to Babeuf. But I was completely unaware of this. And so I started years later to work on that painting and trying to understand why I reacted to that painting shouting, because I was shouting, Guernica, you know. So this is a case of estrangement, in fact, because, I mean, I was confronted with a completely unknown painting, and there was surprise. I was reacting to, but I was unaware of that at that moment, to a kind of frieze-like format in which there is somebody seen in profile from right to left, as in Guernica. And so there is the focus of attention is on the extreme left, but we have to follow this frieze-like composition. And actually, I found, let's say, intermediate links. And I also discovered that Picasso and Braque went to Marseille. Did they see the painting? I don't know. There is a letter by Picasso, I think, to a famous merchant in Paris, art merchant, saying, I went with Braque in Marseille, and Braque, and we looked at tous les nègres, meaning African sculpture. You know, I mean, that was before Cubism, and they were deeply involved in African sculpture. Did they look at Topino Lebrun's painting? I have no idea. But, I mean, I constructed an argument in which, let's say, this kind of morphological connection,
Yeah.
in my view, made sense from a historical point of view.
Cool. Very cool. Entrando um pouco nessa questão do estranhamento e da relação da literatura com a história, né? No seu texto sobre estranhamento, você fala de historiadores e escritores estarem irmanados no mesmo fim cognitivo. Como é que você entende essa relação entre história e literatura no que diz respeito a questões narrativas, mas também no que diz respeito à questão da verdade ou da verdade possível de ser alcançada pelo historiador?
Well, I mean, this is a big topic. I would say, and this is my argument, which I, let's say, worked out when a neo-skeptical approach emerged, arguing that there was no rigorous difference between fictional narratives and historical narratives. And I reacted against this. Also because, in a way, I mean, my first book was recruited among the postmodernists, which I found absurd. Now, so I started to think about, let's say, the real difference, meaning the difference between, we could say, fictional truth and historical truth. So I would argue that since a long time, since, I mean, in our tradition, since ancient Greece, there has been a competition for the representation of reality between, let's say, poets in a large meaning of the word, and historians. But not only competition, also interaction and hybrids. So, for instance, devices traveling from history to novel and the other way around. So, for instance, Balzac saying, I will be the greatest historian of the 19th century. Balzac, the novelist. And so I argued that in a way we can learn from Proust something about history, something about the way of writing history. When Proust said in Le Temps Retrouvé, war, he was thinking about First World War. War is not strategic. This is really profound. In other words, there is a gap between, let's say, the real experience and the theories about it.
Yeah.
Also, in my essay on estrangement, which you mentioned, I argued that Shklovsky's estrangement, which is such a powerful notion, had a long prehistory, which I tried to reconstruct. And this is a kind of politically oriented estrangement. In other words, there is when Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, actually a writer who was deeply familiar to Tolstoy, who is the hero of Shklovsky's essay, and Marcus Aurelius said, but what is, I mean, being a senator, what does it mean? Okay, there is a purple dress. The purple dress is in fact the result of a shell and the juice of a shell. So, I mean, it's a way of distanciating himself, being an emperor, from, let's say, the symbols of political life. And he went on, you know, and there is a long tradition about this. But there is also, as I argued in my essay, a different kind of estrangement, and this is related to Proust, meaning a kind of aesthetic estrangement. And when he's talking about Elstir, the painter who is a kind of mixture between Monet, Manet, and so on, and I mean, he's depicting a landscape, a seascape as a meadow. You know, something incredible. I mean, so let's say looking at a landscape without knowing it and reacting to the experience, the visual experience of it. And this is such a challenge for historians. experience as well, I would say.
E Carlo, você vem de uma família de intelectuais, né?
Yes.
Sua mãe foi uma das principais escritoras italianas do século XX. Você acha que, de alguma maneira, a sua mãe, a sua interação com a sua mãe, com a literatura que ela produziu, influenciou, de alguma maneira, a forma de você escrever história, de pensar história?
Well, I think, in a crucial way, in so many ways that I am unable to describe them. In other words, I think that my notion of narrative is related to, it's related to her. First of all, because, as it happens, she started, my parents started to read fairy tales to me. And in some way, I discovered that my fascination for witchcraft stories was also related to, let's say, fairy tales. I remember a fairy tale in which there is a strange human being, and then we discovered that he is a werewolf. And I've been working on werewolves very recently. A book was published by Chicago University Press. And this is the result of a sort of dialogue which went on for some years between Bruce Lincoln, the historian of religions, and myself. And so there is this divergent work on the same case of a werewolf at the end of the 17th century. And so at the end, there is a the conversation between Bruce Lincoln and myself on comparison, different ways of looking at comparison and so on. So I think that, let's say, for me, the word narrative is basically, certainly, is first of all related to my mother. I still remember when I was a child and we were walking in Turin. I was maybe, I don't know, 10 or something. And she told me about a story about a person who is turned into a bug. I listened to this, and this was unforgettable until I read Kafka's Metamorphosis. So, I mean, those, echoes of stories left such an imprint on me. And, so, yeah.
Okay.
I should also mention my father, because my father who was born in Odessa, and so he was bilingual, and he taught Russian literature until he refused to swear an oath of allegiance to the fascist regime. So his academic career was over. But when he was sent to internal exile during the war, in a small village in southern Italy, and this was the first years of my childhood. Because my mother followed my father over there, and with the children, and my father was working on the revision of a translation of War and Peace into Italian. This was published with an introduction, and the introduction was not signed. It was an asterisk, because my father was unable to sign it, being Jewish. And so this was published, I think, in 1942. And this was the copy I read for the first time, War and Peace. My father already died in 1944 in a Nazi jail. And I think that War and Peace has been the book which influenced me in the deepest way. I think let's say my itinerary to microhistory is multiple, but War and Peace played a crucial role in it.
More than other books of Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and another Russian.
I was deeply influenced by them, but I think that Tolstoy's idea that in order to speak about a battle and provide a description of a battle, you should include, let's say, all the actors, including the humblest soldiers. Well, this was something which I think retrospectively led me to microhistory. I mean, This was a joint project. And I think all of us, as you are going to show in the following interviews and the conversations, all of us approached microhistory with, let's say, starting from a different background and so on. But in my case, this was basically related to literature and philology. You mentioned Auerbach. So more than, I would say, social sciences.
Cool.
Even if, let's say, when I speak about truth, well, this is something which has been shared by social sciences as well. But in any case.
Very cool. Very cool. Então, continuando essa questão, né, eu gostaria de saber, então, já que você acabou de tocar nele, né, a influência e a importância da obra do Erich Auerbach e de outros filólogos, como Leo Spitzer, para o seu pensamento e na forma que você concebe o seu próprio projeto microanalítico.
Well, I think that, I mean, in the case of Auerbach, there has been a kind of metaphorical dialogue. In other words, I've been learning from him along the years. And so I approached his work from different angles. I mean, I've been working for some years on Dante. There was a project about Dante, which maybe will never become a book. But so I also read over and over Auerbach's essays on Dante and his splendid essay on Figura, which is really a masterpiece. And I think this idea of, let's say, working on details, well, I mean, it's a kind of, I would say, it's a kind of convergence between different voices. So you could say, on the one hand, Aby Warburg, God is in the detail, and then Leo Spitzer, and then Erich Auerbach, and then Walter Benjamin, also, let's say, being obsessed by details. So you can see this convergence. But then you have something which I discovered a bit later, meaning Giovanni Morelli, the Italian connoisseur. And so the idea of, let's say, using earlobes and nails in order to identify a painter, and so on and so forth. So I've been working on this. And let's say also the interaction between details and larger comparisons. Because I'm not, let's say, fascinated by details as such, but I'm fascinated by details insofar as they reveal so much. And so they point to something larger. My friend Sanjay Subramaniam asked me to write an essay which was published in the Cambridge History of the World on microhistory and world history. It's an essay which I think it has been published, well, in a few languages, but not yet in Italian. And so I will have to translate myself, which is a boring enterprise. But, in any case, so I started to work on, to reflect on this interaction between microhistory and world history. Actually, it started from Francesca Trivellato's article, in which she asked, it was a sort of half rhetorical question, does Italian microhistory have a future? And in the context of global history. And so I tried to start from her answer and to provide sort of not conflicting but different answer.
Yeah. Another one. Em uma conversa que nós tivemos anteriormente, você me disse que leu Aby Warburg e Walter Benjamin mais ou menos na mesma época, e que ambos tiveram uma forte influência na sua forma de conceber a história. Você disse, né, não só ele, mas outros pensadores em relação aos detalhes, né? Benjamin, ele nos diz que devemos desintegrar a linearidade da narração historiográfica para tentar chegar ao que ele vai chamar de âmago da história, né? Para perceber os encontros entre o outrora e o agora. ele nos diz que devemos reconstruir a narração dos acontecimentos históricos por uma técnica próxima da montagem. Ele vai chamar de montagem, né? E o que é impossível não remeter essa questão ao Warburg, né? Ou seja, de topografia das tensões que animam um processo ou um evento. Qual seria a influência mais permanente de Walter Benjamin na sua forma de pensar e descrever a história? As análises que o Benjamin constrói acerca das imagens têm ou teve alguma influência no seu pensamento?
Well, I mean, it's a difficult question. It's a challenging question because Benjamin is a continent in some way, and a sort of hidden continent, notwithstanding the enormous amount of work on his work. There is something opaque and elusive about his work, I would say. And actually, I realized that I quoted passages from Benjamin's work in two occasions at the end of the introduction of my book, The Cheese and the Worms, and at the very end of my book, Storia Notturna. So Benjamin as providing a kind of epilogue, which would be also a starting point, because research is endless. So it's not a real end, but it's a sort of temporary conclusion. On the other hand, I think that, let's say, I never used Benjamin in a sort of as a sort of analytic tool.
Okay.
Although what you said about the montage is something which is very important to me. I would say that behind Benjamin and his use of montage, there is Sergei Eisenstein. And actually, there is something bizarre about this, because when I was 10 years old, I read in Italian, the Italian translation of a book, which was a collection of Eisenstein's essay on cinema. And I was unable to understand much of it. I'd never seen a movie by Eisenstein, but I was fascinated by this, let's say, incomprehensible book. For instance, his essay on the color yellow, which is fascinating. Obviously, I was completely unaware of the fact that behind this, there was the yellow star. I mean, and then much later, well, I started to see Eisenstein's movies. And then I read Eisenstein's marvelous essay on the origins of the close-up, which he connected to Charles Dickens. And I think that, let's say, my way, which has been a kind of immediate choice when I started to write history, using numbered paragraphs, has been influenced ultimately by cinema and Eisenstein. So the idea of creating cuts, creating gaps in a sort of argument. So we have, and I've been obsessed until now by punctuation. You have commas, semi-commas, full stops, and then a blank, and maybe numbered paragraphs. Now, I wrote an essay on the most famous blank in literature, meaning Gustave Flaubert's blank in L'Éducation sentimentale, which has been the focus of Marcel Proust's magnificent essay on Flaubert. This is a lecture I gave in Jerusalem a long time ago, and it's published in that book, History, Rhetoric and Proof. In Italian is Rapporti di Forza. I had a few essays. Yeah, so I mean, the idea that it's possible to, I mean, in a way I was responding to Proust's argument. So he was looking at Flaubert's blank as a literary device. But I looked at it as a device which could be looked at in a historical context and from a historical point of view. So, I mean, a sort of absurd project, but if everything would be easy, it would be also boring, both for the author and the reader.
Yeah.
So, as Voltaire used to say, I accept all genre, all literary genre, except le genre ennuyeux, the boring genre.
That's cool. Yeah. E, Carlos, você acabou uma última pergunta, né, para a gente terminar. Você acabou de citar a Francesca Trivellato, né, em um artigo dela bem famoso, né? Então eu queria te fazer uma pergunta sobre a microhistória. Você acredita na relevância ainda hoje da microhistória em um contexto historiográfico marcado por vários pós-modernismos e pela história global? Então, parafraseando o título de um artigo dela, né? Existe futuro para a microhistória numa era de global history, de histórias e de historiografia, de uma historiografia pós-moderna?
As I said in that essay I mentioned before, I tried to answer this question saying yes. And actually, I think that, let's say, global history, well, first of all, using history not as historia rerum gestarum, in other words, as historical narrative, but as res gestae, meaning history as a phenomenon, meaning, let's say, the globalization we mentioned before about the pandemic. So we are living in a world which is much more, let's say, interacting as it was in the past, ever. Although we can say that, this globalization did not start 1 century ago, but many centuries ago. But still, what is going on today is a challenge to historians. And I think at so-called global history, and here I'm shifting to historia rerum gestarum, to historical writing, it's one of the possible answers to this phenomenon. So I'm not saying that microhistory is the answer, not at all. I think that microhistory is one of the possible answers. And I tried to explore in the essay I mentioned before how a case can lead to much larger questions which are related to a global context. But this is just an example. And so I would say the challenge is there, and there will be multiple answers, and microhistory is one of those answers.
Okay.
But obviously, first of all, there is no micro-historical orthodoxy. That would be ridiculous. There are different ways of approaching microhistory. And also, as I used to say, bad microhistory, bad history. So we are not protected by microhistory as a project from writing bad history. This is part of the historian's freedom.
Carlo, ancora una volta grazie mille per il tuo tempo e per la tua dolcezza nel rispondere alle mie domande.
It has been such a pleasure, such a joy, this conversation, and I'm very grateful. So, well, good luck to everybody, and alla prochaine, who knows?
Alla prochaine. Thank you very much.
Thank you.